Good afternoon. My name is James Rosebush, and I'm happy to talk to you for just a second. I grew up with a dad who was a teacher of public speaking. I went on to work in the White House for the great communicator Ronald Reagan, and I packaged all of this up, everything I learned from both of these individuals and more from other world leaders too, including Lady Thatcher, into my new bestseller, Amazon #1, Winning Your Audience. Speak with the confidence of a president. I hope every one of you will get this handbook. It's packed with stories and lists of things that you can do so that you can become a great and powerful speaker. Thank you.
See all of you.
Hi.
And you. Nice to see you again. Nice to speak to you again. Are you well?
Yeah, that's great. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. So where are you?
I'm in the UK right now. I'm in London.
In London. Okay. Good.
I'm in upstate New York.
Oh, where in New York?
Westchester. I kind of fled Manhattan and kind of stuck here.
Oh, but I think it's probably better than being stuck in Manhattan.
Oh, for sure. I've had a complete scene down there now. So,
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah.
Really tough. Yeah. Well, it's strange times.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, two quite different approaches to the response to the virus as well, isn't it? With Trump's response to Boris Johnson's response. Who do you think's dealing with it better, out of opinion?
Well, I've been doing a lot of radio interviews, and they always ask me, they're all asking me a lot of comparing between Trump and Reagan and so forth. But I think, becoming a leader of a country is a job for which there is absolutely no training. You get in these roles and you're thrown all kinds of untoward and unplanned incidents that you have to be able to manage well. And you obviously, I think you have with both Boris Yeltsin and with Trump, two people who are fighters and they love their countries and they are not going to fail. They're very competitive people. And that is why I think, one of the great positive marks that Trump gets from me is that I know I want to cast my confidence in him because I know he's not going to go down. He's not going to let our country fail. And I think that there are a lot of ways that I would amend his communication style. I'm not critical of it because he is speaking for a lot of his constituents and a lot of his base that have said things to me like, we're not bothered by the way Trump talks because he's saying the things that we would like to say, to the media, for example. And, he's fighting back. And I think that because he's so successful, that's why he gets the kind of competition that he does, because it's always the job of the opposition party to tear down the party that's in control. Yeah. And I think when you've been in politics, you recognize that, and it gives you a bit of a perspective of relief because this is just part and parcel of political competition and gamesmanship. Although I have to say that leftists are much more brutal and dishonest in the way they attack. Conservatives we just don't have that, anger and hatred, and we don't communicate it that way in general. Yeah. So it's tough for us when people talk to us like that.
Yeah, sure. I know I've got a question. How do you feel about Trump's decision to cut funding to the WHO?
I think it's brilliant and it's long needed. And so, the idea that, oh my goodness, this is not the time to do this. I think this is exactly the time to do it.
Definitely. Tedros has just proved himself to be totally incompetent at his job and really so corrupt. I mean,
totally corrupt. Totally corrupt. And if you look at all these, it's just part and parcel of what Nikki Haley has said. All of these multilateral organizations are controlled by our adversaries, not by our allies. And the very fact that China should be admitted to the Human Rights Council, I mean, the absurdity of that. What do people think, that we're a world of dummies just being willing to be, roll over when our politicians take our tax money? By the way, when this is always something that's bothered me. They always say, well, we're going to defund the WHO, or we're going to make a grant to the WHO. What do you mean we're going to? It's you're going to. That money is the taxpayers' money. And I find it offensive when a government, conservative or leftist, will say, well, we're going to give money to the WHO, or we're going to defund. That is where they should be saying, we're going to invest your money into it. That is not their money. That is my money. It comes out of every hour that I work and the sweat that I put into it to earn it. So I find that really offensive, but I think it is something that is a lot of change, obviously, is brought about through pain. We're suffering a lot of pain right now, but a lot of good things come out of it. And one should be the most important, that the world should be waking up to the absolute menace of China. I mean, we're really fighting World War III right already. And if people don't get that, they're asleep. We're fighting World War III with China right now. And the fact that if you want to see what China can do to the rest of the world, just look right now. And I think, when people say to me, well, why did this happen? In perhaps more existential terms, why did coronavirus happen? So many people are suffering, all this kind of stuff. I said, I thought long and hard about it. And this was my answer, and how I answered it for myself. And that is, coronavirus came to prevent a military conflict that would be called World War III. It came to awaken people to the fact that we cannot have all of our pharmaceuticals and all of our tires and all of our, manufactured in China. And we can't allow China to have the string of pearls, and be taking control of global economies in every continent. That has to absolutely stop now. And I think with Trump, and I think with Boris Yeltsin, we can get somewhere with that.
That's so true.
Sorry to go on and on, but you got me on my.
Yeah, completely
I
agree.
have a follow-up question for you. Do you think it's up to the governors or Trump to reopen the states or the economy?
That's a really good question. And I think another principle or precept of our government in the US that's come to the fore as a result of COVID-19 is that we are a federalism system. So I don't know whether this would be likened to the Commonwealth or not, but I think that it is important because conditions do vary in different parts of the country. And I think that for the governor of Wyoming to be able to open before the governor of New York, I think that it is, and I think Trump is handling this perfectly. I think the federal government can give overall standards, but I don't think they should be able to control when a state kind of safely reopens. I think it's been working, and I mean Trump has been saying this, and I believe him. He has a good working relationship now with all the governors. They talk more constructively. And so I would say it has to be a hybrid. I think that this governors absolutely should have the option. They're kind of the presidents of their own state. But on the other hand, the federal government can withhold funds or can give funds. There are, of course, federal laws, there are federal standards. And so I think the answer is that the governors should have the right to reopen when they want to, but also adhering to federal standards. Because if you take the controversy we had before COVID-19 with sanctuary states, can a state disobey a federal law or a federal mandate and create sanctuary cities to harbor undocumented immigrants? This is something that, when this is the dust is settled from this a little bit, we have to go back and figure this out, because I think illegal immigration is one of the features that figures into coronavirus as well, because I was shocked when I read, even after Trump had shut down immigration from China, 420,000 Chinese had come to America after he had basically shut it down. Now, maybe some of these people were people who were American citizens, but they had been in China or something. But that was a number I saw. I'm like, what? How can we allow that?
Yeah, obviously the talk about China at the minute is absolutely massive. How do you think it compares to the power that the Soviet Union held before 1991? Mainly sort of in the Reagan years when the Soviet Union was coming to an end. Do you think this could be the end of China's global dominance?
Well, first of all, China and the Soviet Union are completely different. The Chinese are industrious. They are brilliant on a lot of different fronts. Their economy, the Chinese economy, is much more sophisticated, whereas the Soviet Union was really a tiny economy and still is. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that today, the real weapons of our warfare, so to speak, are technology. And I think China is highly advanced in that. They know that their way to control the world is through the world's monetary, financial, and technological development. And that's exactly what they're pursuing. That's exactly what they've been doing all over the world. And they're pursuing their 100-year strategy. They want to become the dominant force in the world. The problem with that is that when they do, if they do, and they might very well accomplish their goal, we will be their slaves. And they will dictate to us how many children we have, where we will worship or not. What we will be the slaves of a state. And there's so much massive ignorance about that. I think, well, we need China for this, we need China for that. We don't need China at all. And I think the world has to wake up to that. If China wants to pursue its policies, I think in the United States, for one, we're going to have much more restrictive laws in terms of how much the Chinese government can invest in, for example, our real estate sector. They own, oh my gosh, they own so many buildings in New York. They own so much real estate. They own so many companies. Because they can do it. And I think for decades we've been like, oh, this is great. No, it's not. No, it's not, because they're a political economy, and because it's much easier for a totalitarian state to advance its economic objectives, because it can tell its people, you will work 7 days a week. You will only have one child. You will do this, you will do that. But now I think people are gaining this insight. Even last night I was watching, there was some report, maybe on Epic Times, that these wet markets, they haven't shut them down at all.
No, the WHO have done nothing about them.
And why isn't the world outraged about this? I would say to China, we're not taking another tire or G5 or whatever it is. We're not taking one more product from you until you shut down your wet markets. That's what we would say in our own countries. I mean, if we did something that in a free market economy, if we did something to harm the rest of the world like China has done, don't you think they would be all over us and we would do it?
That's so true.
So I have a question for you, slightly moving on to a different topic. So Winston Churchill supposedly once observed that anyone who is not a liberal at 20 years of age had no heart, and anyone who is still a liberal at 40 has no head. As a young, fairly young conservative, I like to think I have a good heart and a good head. But I know I'm a small minority among young people. My question is, how do we get more young people to embrace conservative values and get them involved in politics?
So this is the big issue, right? Because we have thinking of our future. So Churchill also said, the further you can look back, the farther you can go ahead. And I think this is the answer to your question, that what the leftist, I would say, dominating bureaucracies in education have been doing is wiping out history lessons. And that to me is a part of a totalitarian regime, is to eliminate history, cultural history, military history, and they allow leftist educators to tell people, to tell students things that are patently untrue. And here again, you have this problem of conservatives. We're just not aggressive enough. We're not, you know who Charlie Kirk is, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Charlie Kirk, I mean, I think he's the one guy we are pinning our hopes on, right? Because, you know, I was around him at CPAC this year, and like I said to a friend of mine, I said, that guy has security. He has like agents going around with him. I said, why does he need security? And he's not an elected politician. Well, when you see the things that he's saying, which are 1000% correct, he has a lot of death threats. Well, what? Why? You know, the leftists don't want to allow anyone else to say anything that isn't patently in agreement with their what do you call it, package of lies. I mean, what they're trying to say is their dominating theory, and that they know that they're right. And I think it comes out of the fact that they're wrong. Because have you ever had a kid try to convince you that they want more candy to eat, you know, and they're like, why not? You told me yesterday that I could have more candy. And you know, even though you didn't. Well, I think that's like leftists. They're insisting that take, for example, the governor of Michigan, and there were a couple of other governors that did this too, that they're not allowing any regular surgery except for abortions, because they say that it protects health. It protects health. And I'm like, protects whose health? You know, they're not allowing people who are sick to have operations right now, but they are allowing people to have abortions. That does not add up in my mind. I mean, my mind is not. Let's just say I'm not either, you know, on the left or the right, but my mind doesn't get that. It's like people are like, now they're saying that, oh, they really like, you know, Cuomo. Oh, he should be president. He's making these every day. He's going on and he's making these nice, you know, he can talk because he is articulate. And then I hasten to remind people that Cuomo was the man who, the first governor to pass legislation in the New York General Assembly to allow babies who are born to be murdered.
That's awful. That's so awful.
I was driving my car on the turnpike or something when I heard that. I pulled over and I wanted to throw up. I'm like, that couldn't be right. That couldn't be right. Because that, and I'm sure that the Supreme Court will have to overturn that at some point, but he was celebrating that you could actually have a live birth and decide whether or not the child would live.
It's crazy.
I'm like, what? That isn't that capital murder?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have that in the UK or not, but that's
No.
like,
Thankfully not, but I still feel as though the left have managed to push their agenda when it comes to social issues like abortion, and there seems to be no voices that are openly speaking against this. And I really wish we could be more like America in that respect, with more, you know, people championing conservative social, you know, issues. And yeah, it's a shame.
The thing is,
well,
in
I
the
think
UK,
because we have more people, so we had the Women's March, you know, in Washington, and thousands and thousands of women who are obviously pro-life marched in Washington, and that made, especially this year, because the opposition or the pro-choice people didn't have much of a showing. So I think there's a big, you know, as long as we can keep Trump and Boris Johnson in power, the better.
Yeah.
Because
say
that is the only way we're
UK
going to stem it. Sorry,
UK haven't had a really conservative prime minister since probably Margaret Thatcher in 1990 when she left
Right.
office. We haven't
Right.
had any social conservatism.
It's true.
Then John Major was quite weak on the social conservative
Very.
values. And then David Cameron was very socially liberal, I would say. So I think what you're saying about the social conservatism is completely right. And the thing is as well, we need to make sure that young people understand the values of social conservatism. I don't know what you think of that, James, but you know, I think the social conservatism needs to be promoted a lot more in a positive light, rather than being seen as this sort of medieval concept which certain people like to portray it now.
Well, you know, this is the story I tell. So when I was doing my last book, True Reagan, I was doing a book signing in Nantucket. I was out on the sidewalk in front of the bookseller, and this mother came along and she said, "Oh my gosh, you wrote a book about Reagan. Oh, my son is a conservative, and could you just wait here?" Because it was about closing time. She said, "Could you just wait here because he'll want to come over and buy a book and have you sign it?" So I said, "Absolutely, I'll wait as long as it takes," because her son was playing soccer or something. So finally, the guy came over. He's at St. Andrews University right now, and his name is George Psychos. And so I said, "Tell me about." He was like a sophomore in high school. I said, "How is it that you became a conservative? Was it because of your parents?" And he said, "Oh no, oh no, oh no." He said, "I decided I had to figure out for myself how to think." And he said, I stayed up all one night. I went into our family room. I got, you know, he's a sophomore in high school. Excuse me. He gets out his laptop and he takes every issue, every major issue, and he looks up what the left says about it, and he looks up what the right says about it. And he said, I had to say that the position on every single issue, whether it was trade or abortion or whatever it is, that the way the right explained it and the principles that they stood for were the only ones that made logical sense to me. You know, like just take that issue we were just talking about, live birth abortion. I don't even get the logic of what that is, how it is you're allowed to murder someone. And so much of their logic is, well, it isn't logical. So I always tell that story because that young man who then proceeded to invite me to come to his community, and he arranged a standing only talk for me to give. I mean, the place was so packed. And he was only in high school. At that time, I think he had become a junior in high school. And do you know what his high school principal did? He went to what we call a public high school here, which is up for the public. And the principal of his high school called him into her office, and she said, "I have to tell you, George, we're not able to guarantee your personal safety here." And he's like, "What? We know why is that?" "That's because you're a conservative, and there are a lot of students here who are really mad at you, and they hate you, and I just want to tell you now, we're not able to guarantee your personal safety. I'm like, when he told me that, I'm like, George, what can I do to help you?
Yeah.
I found that shocking. And can you really look in the face of a leftist and tell them that story? And they would just, they would say, oh, well, that's a made up story, that didn't happen or whatever. But it wasn't a made up story. He told me exactly what happened. Why should that be allowed?
Yeah, I feel like it's similar in the UK. I worked in the school as one of my first jobs, and the now Environment Secretary, George Eustace, he came into my work, and I remember all the other teachers saying, I'm not going to let him come into my classroom, all these kind of things. And I think in a way that's one of the problems why a lot of young people are left-wing and not right-wing, is because of the teachers. It's kind of fascinating. I know a lot of the PPE lecturers at Oxford are very left-wing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Infiltrated the educational establishment so they can push their agenda on young, impressionable minds.
Yes.
It's just, I mean, in the UK, I know it's crazy. I've just moved schools as well, because my last school was so left-wing and just pushing this agenda that was untrue. Still, there was a huge backlash against Brexit. Even after, we'd been voting for it and we'd voted for the Conservative Party. So, yeah, it was crazy.
I think it's the luxury of, like, if you look at Elizabeth Warren, who was running for president, she made a salary of $286,000 a year at Harvard University, and she never even taught a course.
Oh, wow.
So I believe that this is what happens in the education establishment, because they have tenure and basically you can't fire them. I mean, if you have to go out on the streets and you have to get a construction job, or you go out on the street and you're a tradesman or whatever it is, and I work. I'm always looking for my next contract or my next book to write or whatever. I don't have the luxury of sitting around and thinking, oh, I think our country should become a socialist country. I'm like, what? I mean, I think that these students and these teachers are put in these positions of basically economic security. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, she wants to change the world to suit her vision, because she's sitting around making this huge salary and doing nothing that has any kind of accountability. What kind of accountability does she have? Does she get, to me, a teacher, the accountability of a teacher is, did your kids pass that math grade? Well, a lot of our public schools are majority of them are failing our students. One of the most evil things that Obama did, because I've been involved in trying to transform education, I was acutely aware of this. So when he became president, we had a program here in Washington, D.C., where underprivileged, which is kind of old-fashioned term, but let's just say, basically it's poor Black kids who were in underperforming schools, got full scholarships at prep schools, private schools. And that money was a grant from the federal government. It was like, I don't know, $2 million a year or something like that, where I think every year, like 35 kids, African American kids who were in underperforming schools, got to go to elite prep schools. He took that money away because of the education union. Now, can you tell me that he was serving people of his own race by doing that? That is disgusting to me.
I mean, there you go. Like, that's about leftists. They're so hypocritical. That's the one thing. They're so quick to be violent and to criticize others, yet they cannot see their own failings and their own twisted agendas.
And I think that is, when a person, I think you can always tell when a person is not right in their judgment when they're violent or too aggressive about it.
Yeah.
That to me also says a lot. If someone is confronting me in a in a violent way, they must have a need. It's kind of going back to what I was saying about they know that they're wrong, but they're afraid of losing control. And I think, have any of you, by the way, watched this TV show called Occupied?
No.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you have to watch it. It's Norwegian.
Right.
Oh, I think I've heard of it.
It is incredible. And it's been on for 3 years. It's like 6 or 8 segments a year. And it's all about this leftist politician in Norway. I mean, it's fictitious, but it's all based on beautiful buildings and, you know, countryside and everything in Norway. But this liberal politician is trying to force basically, I would say, all of Western Europe to adopt his leftist energy policy. So, as Norway supplies a huge percentage of energy to Western Europe, he was going to shut down all the oil and gas business. And what happened is that Russia came in and occupied Norway because of the very fact that he was going to shut it down. I mean, he's a very weak leader, but it has a lot of political import for the things that we're just talking about right now.
Yeah. I have so many questions.
No, please, I'm sorry to talk on so much.
It's fascinating. So going back to World War II, there's always been a special relationship between the UK Prime Minister and US President, from Churchill and FDR defeating the Nazis, from Reagan and Thatcher working together to win the Cold War and help the world out of a global recession. So I have 2 questions related to this. First, what enabled and what was the key to the remarkable success of Thatcher and Reagan's relationship? And secondly, I remember in 2016, I was kind of hoping, and I think a lot of Brits and perhaps the Americans too were hoping that Trump and Theresa May were like Thatcher and Reagan 2.0.
Yeah.
But here they did not have the best of relationship. It was certainly presented that way through the media. And why do you think they didn't perhaps get along as well as Boris and Trump, or even Reagan and Thatcher?
Okay, to start at the end there, I would say that Trump perceived Theresa May as she was. She was not a real conservative, and she was weak. And this is unfortunate for her as a woman in particular, because I must say I had sympathy for her, but I also knew what she was doing wrong. She was not able to pull off Brexit because she wasn't strong enough. And she needed to be she needed to be belligerent like Trump is, because that's the only way you're going to win against leftists. And so Trump said some things about her that were, I think, accurate. I don't think I would have voiced them publicly, but he did. And so that, of course, did not endear him to Theresa May. I wish that Theresa May had succeeded, but I'm not sure that she really believed in Brexit.
No.
And so Brexit is so important. I mean, if you watch Occupied, you will see what happens. So there's a very weak EU minister who comes to the Prime Minister of Norway. I mean, basically, he treats the head of state in Norway as a nothing. And it's EU, it's all EU. And EU is going to dictate the energy policies of Norway. And it helps. I think it would help if everyone watched that program, because if you have an open mind, because it would help exhibit exactly the importance of Brexit. And I was a huge Brexit person, as you know. Thatcher and Reagan were opposed to Great Britain going into that ridiculous, basic tyrannical group that had to dictate everything from immigration to the color of eggs you bought and used, and all that kind of stuff. Because I think that Reagan, don't miss reading this book. It's called A Pope and a President. Have you heard about this? A Pope and a President is a central reading. It's like every young person should read this book because it goes back to World War I, which was the most defining moment of all, really, I think, in human history, because it realigned the West completely. And if you get that, it's really like in one book getting like world history for the West. And it's a long book, but it's really worth doing. So you have the compact of Reagan and Thatcher and Lech Walesa and the Pope. And thankfully, unlike the current Pope, oh my gosh, who's a,
That's not even stuff.
and I don't think popes should be involved in politics anyway, but I think that John Paul was, and I had the great privilege of being blessed by him 3 times. I think that he knew his values were, primarily spiritual, but he also, because he loved people so much, you could see that in his eyes when he looked at you and blessed you. Oh my gosh. So he and Reagan had this spiritual bond, and they believed that they owed it to all the people of the world to liberate them from tyranny and to give them the opportunity to be free for one principal reason, especially on the part of Reagan and the Pope. Thatcher, maybe not so much, but Reagan and the Pope believed that the only way that people could have the right to worship God is if they were free.
Yeah.
So if they were free of domination of the state, because in these totalitarian systems, it's the worship of the state, it's not the worship of God. And that was their goal. It wasn't so much political freedom as it was the gaining of the right to worship God through political freedom. And that's what they really were bound together in that. So Thatcher and Reagan, I think a bit of it, having been to, number 10 and having been around both of these leaders, I would say that they were more different than they're portrayed as being alike.
Yeah, I've got a question. So many Christians obviously support Trump and Brexit. Do you think this is a coincidence?
Well, maybe because, Christians are among the most persecuted group in the world. And I think if it isn't a coincidence, it should be, and Christians should be awake. Instead of being leftists themselves, they should be awake. I mean, the Catholics are being led by a pope who would lead them into tyranny where they wouldn't be able to practice Catholicism at all. But they don't get that. But I want to go back to the Thatcher. I'm not sure I answered your Reagan Thatcher thing. So they were definitely true conservatives, no question. They were brought up by Thatcher's father was a minister and Reagan's mother was a minister. So they were imbued with different churches. She was a Methodist. He was a Disciples of Christ. I think he was a bit more into his spirituality maybe than she was. And they turned out differently. Mm-hmm. Reagan left the White House the same person as he was when he entered. He had a saying on his desk, there's no limit to what a man can do or what he can achieve if it doesn't care who gets the credit. Thatcher, unfortunately, from the first days that I met her, she'd already been in office. She was very personable and, would just have a conversation with you. So then later, after I left the White House and I had an office in London, I was invited by her chief of staff to go on a campaign visit with her to her constituency. And I began to see that even though she had to be reelected for her seat, she was believing after the Falklands in her own superiority. And that was her downfall. So in the end, you saw the distinctions between Reagan and Thatcher, but there remained a very special time in history. And to go back to your first point about a special relationship, for me personally, this is really, really important. I mean, I feel, I have a kind of funny thing that I say to my friends, I put the Queen to bed every night because I'm on Instagram for Buckingham Royal. You know, I have 3 different sites that I'm on. And having had the extraordinary honor of spending time with the Queen, I'm just, you know, she's like my favorite in the whole world. And I think I have such massive respect for her, and having spent time with her and gaining these insights, I would say that she has so much respect from me. And I always say this about the Queen. The Queen is the one living human being on the entire face of this globe who knows more about the history of the past 60 years than any other person alive. Because think about it, she's the only head of state that served for that long and every day has had briefings from her boxes. Now, she doesn't write about it, unfortunately. She's not going to write an autobiography, and she doesn't talk about it, which is something that she believes in and is unique to her. But I look at her and I think, you know, when people belittle her or they whatever, I'm like, oh no, you don't get it at all. So I just had to make that personal note to say how much I feel a special relationship with the UK. And I think that America does, and most of our other presidents, but I think especially Ronald Reagan felt that bond and that special relationship without a question, because Reagan was a man of history. He loved history, and in 96% of his speeches, he quoted from the Patriots, the Prophets, Churchill, and even opposition party leaders as well. But he believed so much in the power of history and knowing it, as Churchill did. And I think those are very, those are qualities that I think he shared with the true people of Great Britain. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, definitely, and it's actually the Queen's birthday today as well.
I know.
Which is a nice little thing to go with this conversation. Just on the subject of President Reagan, what was it like to be in and around the White House with him, working with him sort of every day? And what was he like behind the scenes? Obviously, he was a great communicator to the public, but what was he like as a man rather than a president?
Well, it's very interesting. This is a very interesting point that I had to learn from being around him. The reason he was called a Teflon president was because he had no ego, but he was also very impersonal. So you could, he could call you on the phone at my home. I could be walking with him. I mean, you've seen pictures of me around the White House. You know, having a picnic on the lawn with him. We both have our blue jeans on, you know, and he writes me these nice notes. Very loving, kind, no ego, no self-importance. But on the other hand, he was uniquely impersonal. And I learned this is the most important trait in great leadership. If he felt that he was concerned about what you thought of him, or that he got engrossed in your personality, it would have taken away his power as a great leader, and it would have taken away that Teflon coating that he had. Because, believe it or not, Ronald Reagan was a person who didn't care what you thought of him. Now, I know I can't say this about myself. You know, very few human beings could think, well, no, I don't really care what people think about me. I think it's a human trait, but I began to see it as a weakness, and especially in leadership. So while he could be very kind, you know, and I have 6 leather-bound albums of photographs, which someday I'd love to show you if you're interested, because it shows the backstory of everything.
Yeah, of course.
But these are all things that show the life of, living the life with the Reagans as I did. I had a very unique job. But some people, I think, when they left the White House, they were hurt that the Reagans didn't keep up with them, or they were not the kind of people that would say, I mean, the president wouldn't say to me like, how are your kids? Or, did you get a new house? He wasn't involved in your details, but he was very kind to you and not egocentric. Do you get what I'm saying? This was something brand new for me to see in great leadership. Now, here's why it's a part of great leadership. If you follow this equation, if you don't care what someone thinks about you're not tying your decision-making to polls. You're not tying your decision-making to what people think of you, or you're not making decisions based on what you want people to think of you. So his thinking, his decision-making process was unfettered by personal popularity. Now, and I think, I have to say, I think probably Boris Yeltsin is like this to a certain extent as well. I think most of us, and this is again what happened to Thatcher, she went off the deep end because she was obsessed by personal power, and it changed her whole character. As I say, Reagan, he was the same person the day he walked out of the White House as the day he walked in.
I have a question about Nancy. I understand you're her chief of staff. What do you think her influence was on, or how much of an impact or influence do you think she was on his presidency?
Well, I have two answers for that. A lot of journalists tried to belittle and eclipse the power and majesty of Ronald Reagan by saying Nancy Reagan was the power. And she wasn't. And I know that for a fact because I was there. I could be in their bedroom briefing them, or I could be, we could be in a motorcade together or whatever. Ronald Reagan was a very powerful and stubborn person. It wasn't easy to change his views. He believed in these principles, and he said them over and over and over again, and the media were really like, does he have to say this again?
Yeah.
He had very simple beliefs, conservative beliefs, and he would not change them. The longer time has gone on, so on the other side, the longer time has gone on, I've seen that Nancy Reagan was not a true conservative. First of all, I don't think she was a political ideologue, and she moderated, to me, to the detriment of the president, moderated decisions regarding personnel that affected Reagan's ability to complete his conservative platform. For example, his long-term chief of staff, James Baker, who I worked with, was a Bush person. James Baker brought in more Bush people. Now, I love both 41 and 43 as people, George Bush and George Bush. They're not conservatives. They were not conservatives then. They're not conservatives now. They don't believe in conservative principles. And so Nancy Reagan, wanting to, in some ways, she wanted her, I would say that she was ambitious for her husband. She was not ambitious politically for herself. So the idea, Queen Nancy or this or that, blah, blah, blah. She didn't have any political ambitions, and she wasn't looking for heaven's sakes, when I became her chief of staff, she was the most reviled first lady in history. And, we changed that, we turned that around, but her whole focus was making her husband successful. I would say, even though I got along fine with James Baker, I would say in retrospect, looking at it now, because people always say, compare Trump and Reagan, compare Trump and Reagan. I would say that Trump is taking no prisoners. I mean, he is just barreling ahead and has accomplished more for the conservative movement than actually Reagan. Reagan had a signature accomplishment. He had many thousands of accomplishments, but Trump is not going to. That's why he's had so much turnover, you know. And people are like, "Oh my gosh, he fired this person. Oh, he let go." I'm saying, go for it, because I think there are people that Reagan should have fired, but Reagan was conflict averse. You have to know that Reagan was conflict averse. He could not fire anyone. Trump, he's not conflict averse. He loves conflict. Does that answer your question at all? It's a long story, but
Yeah.
it's
you know, I think that really, like you said, it's presented that she had a much greater influence than you just said. So I think that's fascinating.
Well, she did have an influence, but it wasn't changing him.
Yeah.
It was her ability to make or participate in decisions about who would take on key roles.
Yeah. I have one last question, which is more of a kind of not funny, but maybe not a serious question. I presume you watched the TV series The Americans?
We watched, I think, one of them or something.
Oh, no, I wanted to find out your opinion on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's it from me. I don't know if any of you two have any more questions.
I do. This is about Corona again and the economy. So after all this lockdown, I guess the economy is going to be in a really dire state. So what measures do you think Trump should take to revitalize and regenerate the economy that could be applied to all states?
Well, how weird is this, right? We had the most robust economy in the history of the world like 60 days ago. It hasn't been that long. And I don't see why it is that we can't go back to that. I mean, we were just like cleaning it up. I mean, there was like no unemployment for Black people and women and Hispanic people, and not to mention white people. I mean, it was just incredible. Why wouldn't we be able to go back to that? I think that we have to. I know certain things are going to be different for a while. People are not going to be shaking hands. They're not going to be kissing. They're not going to, there's going to be, and we have to have more testing. I get all that, but the principles of our economy are sound, and we're sound. You saw what the stock market was doing last week, climbing back up. Because why? Because our stock market is the one place where the money of the world goes to invest, because they know it's safe and secure. So I guess in terms of what has to be done, I would say just go back to the way it was. I mean, how can we, obviously we spent all this huge amount of money, which I guess just gets printed. I don't get where does this money come from? It adds to the national debt, which I think is terrible. But I think the fundamentals of our economy are just the way they were.
But do you think certain aspects will change? Like, for example, I guess, China is relied on very heavily by most of the world's economies, and so many things are produced in China, manufactured in China. Do you think that will change at all? I think it will.
Oh, yes. I mean, I hope so. And I think that will be more of an economic boon to the United States and other countries. I think the way you're looking at the economy in Great Britain going forward, I think that there are these, the leftists are such doomsayers, oh, Brexit, oh my gosh, there's going to be a depression in the UK, all this kind of stuff. Why would that have to happen? I mean, if you're taking care of your own country and its trade and what the country needs, I think that Great Britain can retool its industries and bring back a vital economy, just like the United States can. So I think that the fundamentals are there. I think that people that really fueled the economic boom in the United States, developing new companies, new opportunities, new jobs, for which I give Trump total credit. Well, as long as we keep Trump for another 4 years,
Yeah.
I don't think he's going to be a president of a country that's suffering a depression. And I think that he's going to bring back from China a lot of stuff that's being made over there now.
Oh, that sounds really great. I hope the same thing happens over here, because so many of our industries have been decimated over the years, not only by, globalization in China, but also by the EU. So we're in quite a bad state, and I just hope things get better here too. But
I hope so. I mean, I don't know about it. I don't know about Boris Yeltsin's cabinet, if they're strong enough, but I don't think Boris Yeltsin is going to be, that he's going to be bullied by anyone, because he doesn't, he's a fighter.
yeah.
Well, one question, again, just going back to Ronald Reagan, obviously was known as a great communicator. Which would you say is his best speech? Obviously, the Brandenburg Gate speech is obviously one of his most famous. Which would you say is his best speech?
Okay, well, if you get my new book, I hope you're going to tell everyone to buy this now.
Of course.
Winning Your Audience. So, in the top speeches, the top 5 speeches in world history are Churchill's Finest Hours and Reagan's Challenger speech. And I think that certainly Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, which is the way he said it. Excuse me. I think that, to me, well, his favorite speech for me was the one at Schloss Hambach in Germany on the speech to German youth about German reunification. He says, poetically, he said, there are thousands of kids basically there. And he says, today in this crowd is the next Goethe, the next Beethoven, the next, he goes through the history of Germany and he calls on them to rise to greatness. Now, what other head of state do you hear talking like that? He calls on them to rise to greatness and to take up this challenge. So that was one of my favorite. The one speech that goes into the top 5 of all history, this speech of when the Challenger astronauts went down, he makes reference to this poem. He recites part of this poem called Flight by this airman. I think he was British. Wasn't he British, Ethan? He's flying over Great Britain. And he says, he uses this quote, he slipped the surly bands of earth to touch the face of God. I can never say that without tears in my eyes.
Yeah.
Because it was so much translating or transferring the grief of a horrific accident into a spiritual metaphor. And that was what Reagan's gift was in speaking. And I'll leave it there. I think that's a good way to summarize it.
Definitely, completely agree. And one of many fantastic speeches from Reagan, I must say. I think he was fantastic in getting the message across to his opponents. Something that we've seen lacking in recent years, I think, that the 1984 presidential debate, was it, with Walter Mondale, where he got across perfectly what he was about. With Jimmy Carter as well. Are you better off? He was some of these speeches, he was probably the best person in history to get across his points and what he believed. And I don't know if you agree with that. I think you probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a nice way to end. If nobody else has got any more questions, it's
Well, it's so nice to spend time with all of you. I'd love to do it again.
oh, definitely, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that. Really
Sure.
appreciate your time.
Yes,
All
thank
right, be well.
You too, and like I
Thank you
say,
so much.
take care.
Keep in
and I'm sure we
touch.
can do
Really
it
great
again.
speaking to you.
And thank you for being good conservative leaders.
Thank
We
you.
need you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.